In June 1703, the richest man in Hungary wandered lost through the mountains, fleeing a death sentence. With barely 200 armed peasants, he was about to defy the most powerful emperor in Europe. His decision would unleash 8 years of war that would divide families, devastate the kingdom, and end with his perpetual exile. But what was truly at stake was something far greater than his own life. This was a man who could have lived in luxury, who could have accepted the emperor's mercy and retired to a comfortable estate. Instead, he chose to bet everything on a cause that seemed doomed from the start. His name was Ferenc Rákóczi II, and his story would become the defining legend of Hungarian resistance. Since 1526, Habsburg rulers had occupied the throne of the Kingdom of Hungary while simultaneously holding the title of Holy Roman Emperor. During the 16th century, they established the Habsburg Empire in the heart of Europe, a political structure that included Hungary as one of its fundamental pieces. However, there was a crucial difference between Hungary and the other imperial territories, known as the hereditary lands. The relationship between the Habsburgs and Hungary had always been complex and fragile. Medieval Hungarian kings had built one of the most powerful kingdoms in Central Europe, with a tradition of autonomy dating back to Saint Stephen in the year 1000. Hungarian magnates never forgot that their ancestors had freely elected their kings, and that the crown of Saint Stephen wasn't simply a decorative accessory, but a sacred symbol of national sovereignty. This wasn't just romantic nostalgia. The Hungarian kingdom had its own distinct legal system, its own parliament, its own military traditions. When nobles gathered in the parliament in Buda or Pressburg, they weren't merely rubber-stamping imperial decrees, they were exercising real political power that nobles in Austria or Bohemia had long since lost. The Hungarian Diet could refuse taxes, block legislation, and even, in theory, depose an unjust king. This wasn't democracy as we'd recognize it today, but it was a genuine check on royal power that made Hungary unique within the Habsburg domains. While the empire built the foundations of royal absolutist power in these other territories, the Kingdom of Hungary preserved its autonomy. The country had to be governed according to its own laws, and Habsburg rulers were obligated to swear they would respect and maintain these norms. The interdependence mutually resulting from the Ottoman conquests further intensified the need for cooperation between both parties. The Habsburgs needed Hungarian soldiers and Hungarian fortresses to hold back the Turkish tide. Hungarians needed imperial resources and imperial armies to avoid being completely overrun. This autonomy wasn't merely ceremonial. The Hungarian parliament maintained the power to approve taxes, declare war, and pass laws. Hungarian nobles preserved substantial privileges that their counterparts in the hereditary lands had lost decades earlier. The Hungarian nobility, which made up roughly 5% of the population, enjoyed tax exemption and the right to bear arms, privileges they defended ferociously. They saw themselves not as subjects, but as free men whose relationship with the king was contractual, not absolute. After the Ottoman campaign of 1663 to 1664, the situation changed drastically. A Turkish army had swept through the Hungarian plains, burning villages and taking captives. The threat seemed existential. If the Turks broke through, Vienna itself would be at risk. A massive Christian coalition assembled, drawing troops from across Catholic Europe. Despite the Ottomans' initial success, the Allied Christian armies achieved a momentous victory at the Battle of St. Gotthard, which raised Hungarian hopes that this confrontation would finally lead to their liberation from the Turkish yoke. The battle itself was brutal but decisive. Outnumbered Christian forces held a bridge crossing against wave after wave of Turkish attacks. When the Ottoman assault finally broke, thousands of Turkish soldiers were cut down as they retreated. It was the kind of victory that should have changed everything. Such hopes proved fleeting when Emperor Leopold signed peace with the Sultan. Despite the Turkish defeat, the Treaty of Vasvar in 1664 left newly conquered territories in Ottoman hands. This made it clear that the Austrian government didn't prioritize Hungary's liberation. For Hungarians, the betrayal was obvious. They'd spilled their blood on the battlefields, only to see their lands handed back to the enemy at the negotiating table. Bitterness spread like wildfire throughout the kingdom. In taverns and manor houses, nobles whispered that Vienna cared nothing for Hungarian blood, that the emperor saw them as expendable pawns in his larger game. Consequently, disappointed Hungarian magnates, led by Palatine Ferenc Wesselényi, began conspiring against the Habsburgs. Hungarians had always been inept conspirators, and the plot was quickly discovered. As a result, in 1671, Chief Justice Count Ferenc Nadasdy and Croatian Ban Peter Zrinski were publicly beheaded. The executions sent shockwaves through the Hungarian nobility. These weren't simple traitors who had died, but the kingdom's most prominent members of the aristocracy, men whose families had served Hungary for generations. Vienna's message was clear. Loyalty to the emperor was non-negotiable, and dissent would be punished with maximum severity. But the execution of these nobles wouldn't crush the Hungarian rebel spirit. What came next would prove that resistance was only beginning. A significant number of Hungarians turned against Vienna in a movement led by the talented military leader Imre Türköly. After the successful anti-Habsburg uprising by the so-called Kurucs, Türköly was elected Prince of Upper Hungary in 1682, thus dividing the country into 4 distinct parts. Türköly represented a new generation of Hungarian leaders. Young, charismatic, and militarily competent, he'd learned the lessons from Wesselényi's conspiracy failure. Instead of relying on palace intrigues, he built a real army of discontented peasants, impoverished nobles, and homeless military veterans. His ascent was meteoric. In just 2 years, he went from being a rebel noble to ruling prince of a significant portion of Hungary. He understood what the old conspirators hadn't, that real power came not from secret plots, but from mobilizing the masses who had nothing left to lose. The Kurucs movement wasn't just a military rebellion, it was a social revolution. Türköly promised land to peasants, plunder to soldiers, and revenge to those who'd lost everything to Habsburg taxes and Austrian brutality. His army swelled with recruits who saw him as their salvation. In the mountains of Upper Hungary, he created something like a parallel state with its own administration, its own courts, its own identity separate from both Vienna and the Turks. Türköly's movement and his short-lived principality depended on Ottoman Empire support. This alliance was deeply controversial. For centuries, Hungarians had fought against the Turks, considering them the ultimate existential threat to European Christendom. Now, some Hungarians were willing to ally with their ancient mortal enemy to free themselves from the Habsburgs. The contradiction didn't go unnoticed, but for many, Habsburg oppression seemed the more immediate evil. Priests denounced it as heresy, but hungry peasants didn't much care about theological niceties when imperial soldiers were burning their villages. When the Turks attacked Vienna in 1683, Türköly's forces acted as auxiliary troops under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa's command. It was the ultimate gamble. If the Turks took Vienna, Türköly would become the most powerful man in Central Europe. However, Kara Mustafa suffered a catastrophic defeat, and the successful defense of Vienna marked a decisive turning point in Habsburg politics. The battle for Vienna was apocalyptic. For 2 months, the city was besieged by more than 100,000 Ottoman soldiers. The walls were constantly bombarded, mines dug beneath the fortifications threatening to bring down entire sections of the defenses. Inside the city, people were eating rats and leather. The garrison was down to its last powder reserves. When finally the relief army led by King John Sobieski of Poland finally arrived, the decisive battle became one of the fiercest of the 17th century. The Polish hussars' famous charge down the Kahlenberg Heights crashed into the Ottoman lines like a thunderbolt. The Turks broke and ran, leaving behind their tents, their treasure, their artillery.
Tokoli's Hungarians, caught in the middle of the conflict, fought knowing that an Ottoman victory would mean their rise, but defeat would leave them completely exposed to imperial vengeance.
Under Emperor Leopold's leadership, an international Christian coalition was formed to liberate Hungary. Hungarians fought on both sides during the war. Remnants of Tokoli's troops fought on the Ottoman side, while others fought alongside the Christian alliance. 15,000 Hungarians participated in the battle to reconquer Buda in 1686. The cooperation was crowned with success, and step by step, in the following years, Allied forces expelled the Ottomans from Hungary. The Christian army's successes led to Tokoli's movement decline. He was first captured by the Turks and subsequently employed as a military leader. A decisive liberation battle took place at Zenta in 1697. The army led by Eugene of Savoy faced Sultan Mustafa II's forces. Tokoli fought as one of the Sultan's commanders. The Christian forces emerged victorious, and Tokoli barely escaped with his life. At Zenta, the Ottoman army was literally pushed into the Tisa River. Thousands drowned in the murky waters, crushed by the weight of their own armor and the panic of defeat. Eugene of Savoy had executed one of the most brilliant military maneuvers of the century, trapping the Sultan's army with its back against the river with no escape route. The massacre was total. More than 20,000 Ottomans died in a matter of hours. The river ran red for days afterward, and local peasants reported finding bodies washed up on the banks for weeks. A notable feature of Hungarian historical memory is observed in the fact that Tokoli's statue stands in Budapest's Heroes Square, while Eugene of Savoy's statue, the victorious leader at the Battle of Zenta, stands in front of the royal palace overlooking the city. Hungary's liberation had triumphed militarily, but what Hungarians would discover next would make them wonder if Ottoman occupation had been replaced by something even worse.
Emperor Leopold, who also held the title of King of Hungary, firmly believed that liberating Hungary gave him both the opportunity and the right to incorporate the country into his empire. During the parliament meeting in 1687, the Hungarian estates were forced to renounce their right to elect the monarch, as well as their right of resistance. The right of resistance, known as the Golden Clause, had been guaranteed since 1222 in the Hungarian Golden Bull, a document comparable to the English Magna Carta. This clause allowed the nobility to legally resist the king if he violated the kingdom's laws. It was the cornerstone of the Hungarian constitution, the last lifeline against royal tyranny. Ripping it out meant leaving Hungary defenseless against absolutism. For centuries, this right had been the ultimate check on royal power. The knowledge that a king who pushed too far might face legal, even armed resistance from his own nobles. The scene in the parliament was tense. Imperial troops surrounded the building. Austrian officials made it clear that cooperation would be rewarded, but resistance would be remembered. One by one, exhausted nobles who just endured decades of war voted away their most sacred privileges. Some wept openly, others stared at the floor in shame. They knew they were betraying everything their ancestors had fought for, but what choice did they have? The alternative was another war they couldn't possibly win. Following liberation from Ottoman rule, Hungary was burdened with excessively high taxes that pushed the war-devastated country to the brink of absolute poverty. Former landowners could only reclaim their lands by presenting documentary evidence of ownership, no easy feat after decades of war, and only if they paid 10% of their property's value to the imperial treasury. The practical effect was devastating. Imagine returning to your ancestral estate after the Turks had finally been driven out, only to find you couldn't prove you owned it. The old documents had been burned when the Ottoman cavalry swept through in 1683. The local priest who might have vouched for you was dead. The imperial commissioner demanded official paperwork you couldn't possibly provide, while Austrian courtiers who'd never set foot in Hungary before snapped up estates for a fraction of their value. Soldiers stationed on the frontiers were discharged without any compensation. Veterans who dedicated decades of their lives to defending Christendom against the Ottomans now wandered the roads as beggars. Men who'd seen fortresses fall, who'd survived sieges and bloody battles, now had not even a piece of land to call their own, not even gratitude from those they'd served. Some had served for 30 years, fighting in battles from the siege of Vienna to the reconquest of Buda, and now found themselves homeless in their old age. Both nobles and peasants suffered violence at the hands of occupying Austrian troops. Imperial soldiers treated Hungary as conquered territory. They plundered villages, raped women, confiscated livestock and grain without compensation. When Hungarians protested, they were beaten or imprisoned. Imperial courts systematically ignored Hungarian complaints, always favoring Austrian soldiers regardless of the evidence. As such, Hungarians had every reason to feel that their liberation was merely the beginning of another occupation. Grievances piled up. Entire families lost their ancestral lands because documents had been destroyed during the wars. Veterans who'd fought against the Turks now wandered homeless. Imperial troops treated Hungarians not as liberated allies, but as conquered subjects. Frustration grew in every county, in every town, in every Hungarian household. Stories circulated throughout the kingdom. In Debrecen, a 60-year-old veteran who'd lost an arm in Eger's defense was expelled from his small farm because he couldn't produce the original property title, destroyed when his village was burned in 1683. In Transylvania, a noble widow watched imperial soldiers take her last 3 cows, leaving her without means to feed her 4 children. When she tried to protest, she was publicly slapped by an Austrian officer who told her she should be grateful the empire had bothered to liberate her at all. Amid this collective despair, a young exiled prince was about to make a decision that would change Hungary's fate. But first, you need to know who this man really was.
Ferenc Rákóczi II came from Hungary's most illustrious family, with 6 Transylvanian princes among his ancestors, including the Rákóczis and the Báthories. His maternal grandfather was Péter Zrinski, the executed leader of the Wesselényi conspiracy. Rákóczi's childhood was a whirlwind of violence and separation. He was born in 1676 at Borsi Castle, at a time when his family was already marked as traitors in the emperor's eyes. His father, Ferenc Rákóczi I, died when he was barely 4 months old, leaving him as heir to an immense fortune, but also to a dangerous legacy. From his very first breath, Rákóczi was caught between 2 worlds, the wealth and privilege of one of Europe's great noble houses and the shadow of treason that hung over his family name. From age 9, Rákóczi accompanied his stepfather, Imre Tököly, on his military campaigns. The boy witnessed battles, sieges, and executions. He saw how men died, how cities burned, how war destroyed everything in its path. These early experiences deeply marked his character, instilling in him both an understanding of military strategy and a visceral comprehension of rebellion's human cost. He watched soldiers die screaming for their mothers. He saw what cannonballs did to human bodies. He learned that war wasn't glory and honor, but blood and shit and terror. During his childhood, he witnessed the siege of Munkacs, where for 3 years his mother, Ilona Zrini, defended the castle against imperial forces. Ilona's resistance became legend. With dwindling supplies and surrounded by a superior imperial army, she refused to surrender for 1,044 days. She personally directed the defense, overseeing repairs to the bombarded walls, carefully rationing food, keeping her defenders' morale high. When officers suggested surrender, she had them flogged. When food ran low, she ate the same thin soup as the common soldiers. She became a symbol of Hungarian defiance. Young Ferenc watched from the castle walls as imperial cannons fired day and night.
He learned to recognize the sound of different types of artillery, to calculate where each projectile would fall. He saw men torn apart by enemy fire, heard the wounded screaming, smelled gunpowder and blood. For a child his age, it should have been traumatic, but it was also educational in a way no palace tutor could match. He was learning the realities of power and resistance before he could read Latin properly. Afterwards, he was permanently separated from his mother and received a strict pro-Habsburg education. The Jesuits supervised his schooling, teaching him Latin, German, Catholic theology, and loyalty to the emperor. He spent years in Neuhaus and Prague, surrounded by tutors who systematically attempted to erase any sympathy for his family's rebel cause. They taught him that Thököly was a traitor, that his grandfather had deserved his execution, that Hungary's only hope lay in obedience to Vienna. They tried to make him ashamed of who he was.
Emperor Leopold generously overlooked his rebellious ancestral heritage, even granting him the title of imperial prince. Initially, Rákóczi proved grateful and loyal. He married well to Princess Charlotte Amalie of Hesse-Wanfried, established residence on his vast Hungarian estates, and seemed destined to become just another loyal imperial magnate. He attended court functions in Vienna. He hunted with other imperial princes. He seemed to have successfully navigated the impossible position he'd been born into. However, despite his attempts to ignore his background, the sense of duty that came with his position, his ancestors' traditions along with his surroundings' expectations, proved more powerful. Peasants on his estates told him stories of imperial abuses. Homeless veterans begged him for help. Minor nobles looked to him as their only hope. The weight of expectations grew heavier on his shoulders every day. Everywhere he went in Hungary, people whispered that he was different, that he would save them, that he carried the blood of heroes. In 1700, he secretly wrote to King Louis XIV of France. Such action was a grave offense and, unfortunately for him, didn't remain secret. He was arrested and taken to Wiener Neustadt prison, where Peter Zrinski had been imprisoned before. The charge of treason and his pending fate were the same as his grandfather's 30 years earlier. Rákóczi's cell in Wiener Neustadt was small, damp, and dark. The same walls that had contained his grandfather before his execution now imprisoned him. Each night he lay on the stone cot wondering if he'd wake to face the executioner's axe. Guards told him with macabre delight the details of Zrinski's execution, describing how multiple blows had been necessary to sever his head. He had months to contemplate his fate, to wonder if this was how it would all end. His head on a block, his family's wealth confiscated, his name added to the list of traitors. However, with his wife Charlotte's help, he managed to escape disguised as a soldier. The escape was bold and dangerous. Charlotte bribed guards, obtained uniforms, coordinated distractions. On a snowy November night, Rákóczi calmly walked past guards disguised as a simple soldier carrying messages. He fled to Poland, leaving behind his fortune, his family, his entire life. In the summer of 1703, he returned to Hungary to lead the rebels. With a pending death sentence and barely 200 armed peasants waiting for him, Rákóczi faced an impossible decision. What he did next would defy all military logic. In June 1703, the young Ferenc Rákóczi and his mounted entourage of elegantly dressed men wandered lost through the gorges of the Carpathian Mountains, searching for the way to Hungary. The 27-year-old imperial prince, once the richest man in Hungary, had been exiled for 2 years to Poland, fleeing Emperor Leopold's death sentence. Begged to return by his peasants who'd risen against Habsburg oppression, he came back to lead their uprising. Eventually, in the Polish village of Breznic, Rákóczi's men and the peasant army led by Tamás Ese would meet. The encounter was a mutual disappointment. Ese and his followers had assumed Rákóczi would arrive leading foreign mercenaries, perhaps Polish regiments or Cossacks willing to fight for money. They imagined cannons, well-equipped cavalry, abundant supplies. Instead, they found a handful of exiled nobles in elegant clothes, but not a single professional soldier among them. Rákóczi arrived with courtiers, not warriors. His companions wore silk, not armor. Rákóczi was dismayed to find only 200 armed peasants and 50 horsemen instead of the thousands promised. The peasants carried scythes converted into improvised spears, rusty old muskets, woodcutters' axes. Some didn't even have basic armor, just leather jackets that wouldn't stop even an arrow. The horsemen rode farm horses, not war steeds. Looking at this ragtag assembly, Rákóczi felt his heart sink. Were they going to face Emperor Leopold, the most powerful ruler in Europe, with this pitiful force? It seemed like madness. Though Rákóczi greeted them with an inspiring speech, he spent the next 2 days contemplating his options. He had every reason to turn back. The odds were overwhelmingly unfavorable. His army was ridiculously small, and the enemy was Central Europe's most powerful empire. Any rational military assessment would have concluded this was suicide. His advisors certainly thought so. He could return to Poland, live quietly on a modest pension, perhaps write his memoirs, and hope the emperor would eventually pardon him. Many exiled nobles before him had taken that prudent path. His noble companions advised caution. Wait, they told him. Gather more men. Get French support first. Don't throw yourself into certain death with this pathetic force. Every fiber of common sense screamed at him to retreat, but something deeper pulled him forward. Duty, destiny, or perhaps just stubborn Hungarian pride. Finally, on June 16th at Vedeke Pass, where Arpad had 800 years earlier led the Hungarian tribes across the border, Rákóczi made his decision. As he would write in his memoirs, it was like Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon. There would be no going back. Either he would liberate Hungary or die trying.
Rákóczi's decision unleashed an unexpected domino effect. When news of his arrival spread, people gathered under Rákóczi's banner, which displayed his motto, Cum Deo, Cu Patria et Libertate, with God, for country and liberty. Initial victories meant that everyone, from simple peasants to impoverished Kurut soldiers, nearby town inhabitants, and county nobility, joined his cause. Sándor Károly, for example, who dispersed the rebel forces in June, swore allegiance to Rákóczi in October. Imperial troops couldn't mount strong resistance, as their main forces were committed to battle against the French. The first months seemed to confirm Rákóczi had made the right decision, but what was about to happen on European battlefields would change the entire balance of power. Smash that subscribe button if you want to understand how a prince with 200 peasants defied Europe's most powerful empire, because what's coming reveals the battle that would define all of Hungary's destiny.
The international situation played a significant role in Rákóczi crossing his own Rubicon. By that time, the rivalry between France and Austria for European hegemony had escalated into full-scale war, and he had secured support from King Louis XIV of France. The Sun King saw in Rákóczi's rebellion a perfect opportunity to distract and weaken his Austrian enemies. French gold and French promises flowed eastward, giving Rákóczi the confidence to gamble everything. By autumn, the rebels could freely occupy the territory east of the Tisza River and Upper Hungary, present-day Slovakia. In December 1703, Károly's forces had penetrated Austria, reaching the outer walls defending Vienna. The following year saw a succession of military successes, with Kuruk's forces taking Transdanubia and Transylvania. Town after town opened its gates to Rákóczi. Imperial garrisons surrendered or fled. It seemed like nothing could stop the momentum. Only the borderlands defended by the Serbs and Saxon territories remained under imperial control. The movement had expanded beyond Rákóczi's most optimistic expectations. Almost all of Hungary was under his control, and imperial forces seemed incapable of stopping the Kuruks' advance. Success seemed inevitable, Vienna was within reach, but on the battlefields of Bavaria, hundreds of miles away, the war's true fate was being decided. However, it was in Bavaria, not Hungary, where the decisive battle of the War of Independence took place. Rákóczi and his followers' main hopes lay in joining forces with the Franco-Bavarian army, advancing eastward and capturing Vienna together. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. French armies would crush the Habsburgs from the west, while Kuruc's forces pressed from the east. Vienna would be caught in a vice and forced to grant Hungarian independence. But in the summer of 1704, King Louis XIV's troops suffered a severe defeat against Austro-British forces at Höchstadt in Bavaria, known as Blenheim in British history. From that moment, French support diminished dramatically, and after 1708 ceased completely. The Battle of Blenheim was catastrophic for Hungarian hopes. The Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy executed one of the 18th century's most decisive victories. The Franco-Bavarian army was shattered, losing more than 30,000 men among dead, wounded, and captured. The French, who'd seemed invincible, were completely humiliated. Louis XIV never would fully recover from this defeat. Suddenly, France had its own survival to worry about. Hungary became expendable. The reality that Rákóczi's War of Independence would become part of the European power struggle vanished completely. Hungary was abandoned to its fate. Overnight, the Kuruc's strategic advantage disappeared. Without foreign allies, without external supplies, without the military pressure that kept imperial forces divided. Abandoned by France, the Kurucs now had to face the empire's full fury alone, but their problems ran even deeper than anyone imagined.
In the years that followed, battles continued with varying degrees of success. Imperial forces prevailed in all major engagements, even when outnumbered. The Kuruc army's main weakness was the peasant soldiers' lack of military training, officers' frequent incompetence, the absence of military discipline, and inadequate equipment. The Kuruc army was equipped with far fewer cannons and obsolete weapons. A single imperial artillery battery could break a Kuruc charge before it even reached the enemy lines. Kuruc muskets often misfired or exploded in their users' hands. Against professional imperial troops with modern weapons and drill, the outcome was usually predictable. Despite the imperial army's victories, it didn't have the manpower necessary to occupy the country. Meanwhile, the Kuruc army enjoyed population support in Upper Hungary and the Great Hungarian Plain, helping them win minor battles. Aided by these successes, they could occupy a larger part of Hungary for an extended period, and at times, the entire country. From the beginning, Rákóczi was reluctant to be considered a rebel by foreign governments. He needed to create a legal framework around his uprising. The National Assembly, convened in Széchenyi in 1705, established a noble confederation and elected him leader and prince. In 1707, the National Assembly in Onod declared the Hungarian throne vacant and refused to recognize Joseph, Leopold's son, as the legitimate heir. As Miklós Bercsényi, commander-in-chief of the Kuruc forces, said, "Dogs should rule over dogs," and from that day, Joseph was no longer their king. Rákóczi didn't want to be accused of self-interest by ascending to the throne. Instead, he sought to find a suitable ruler to resolve the country's diplomatic isolation. However, his efforts proved fruitless. The legal declaration had given them legitimacy, but it hadn't changed the military reality. And while Rákóczi searched for non-existent allies, the country was slowly bleeding to death. Hit that subscribe button if France's betrayal is catching you off guard, because the most devastating decision hasn't arrived yet, and it'll forever change Rákóczi's fate.
History recalls Rákóczi's soldiers as the Kurids, while those who served in the imperial army and remained loyal to the court were called labants. The term labants originated from the word Lokenkopf, denoting a tendency of the era to wear elaborate wigs. While the Catholic nobility of the Trans-Danubian region was generally considered Levants, Protestants from the Great Hungarian Plain were more often associated with the Kurucs. This division caused many families to split in their loyalties. Brothers stopped speaking to each other. Sons disowned fathers. The social fabric of Hungary tore apart as neighbor turned against neighbor. For example, Prince and Palatine Paul Esterházy remained loyal to the emperor, while Count Antal Esterházy achieved military success as a Kuruk general. At family gatherings, when they still occurred, the tension was unbearable. Many switched sides from Levants to Kurucs, as exemplified by Vak Botyan's case. Botyan, a soldier of minor noble descent, participated in campaigns that expelled the Ottomans. Though he lost an eye in battle, legend said bullets couldn't harm his body. On one occasion, as an imperial army colonel, Botyan challenged the bravest Kuruk warrior to a duel. Though seriously wounded, a few months later he was seen serving in Rákóczi's army. He became one of the Kuruk force's most successful generals. This undeclared civil war tore apart Hungary's social fabric. Brothers fought against brothers, fathers against sons. Loyalties divided not only by political convictions, but by religion, geographical region, and opportunism. The War of Independence had become something more complex and painful than a simple rebellion against the empire.
By 1710, the Kurucs found themselves in a desperate military situation. The country had exhausted its resources, and the Kuruk army was forced to retreat to just a few counties in eastern Hungary. With the Franco-Austrian peace treaty, Rákóczi lost a potential ally, and his attempts to forge new alliances proved fruitless. Every door in Europe was closing. No one wanted to back a losing cause. The situation was catastrophic in every sense. Peasants, after years of war, couldn't properly cultivate their lands. Fields lay fallow, villages stood empty, famine threatened entire regions. Kuruk soldiers, without regular pay, resorted to plundering to survive, thus alienating the very population they were supposed to protect. The army that had begun as liberators was now just another group of armed men taking what they needed to stay alive. Desertions multiplied day by day. Officers, seeing inevitable defeat, began secretly negotiating with the enemy. The Kuruk army, once a formidable force of tens of thousands, had been reduced to a few scattered and demoralized units. Rákóczi's grand vision of Hungarian independence was collapsing into brutal survival. In the midst of this total collapse, Rákóczi faced the most painful decision of his life. What he did next would haunt him until his last day. In light of these circumstances, Rákóczi traveled to Poland. He told himself he was seeking new allies, but everyone knew the truth. He was abandoning his cause. Meanwhile, in 1711, his deputy, Sándor Károlyi, and the commander of Hungarian origin of imperial forces in Hungary, Count János Pálffy, signed a peace agreement without Rákóczi's presence. The prince who'd started the war wasn't there to end it. As before, this agreement reflected a compromise. The emperor promised to maintain the laws of Hungary and Transylvania, recognize the nobility's privileges, Protestant rights, and grant amnesty to all War of Independence participants. This was called the Treaty of Satmar. It wasn't the independence Rákóczi had fought for, but it was better than unconditional surrender. Emperor Joseph was no longer alive when it was signed in his name in Nad Karol. On April 30 of 1711, on the plains of Mytienyi, Rákóczi's forces drove their banners into the ground as a symbolic gesture before dispersing, keeping their weapons. It was over. Rákóczi didn't seize the opportunity for clemency. Renouncing his wealth and possessions, he sought patrons for the Hungarian cause. Initial attempts to find them were in France, then in the Ottoman Empire, but his hopes were never fulfilled. He became a professional exile, wandering from court to court, always promising that next year, with just a little more support, he could restart the war. But no one was listening anymore. The Sultan installed him and a handful of his followers in Rodosta, where he spent his time attending mass, writing, reading, and doing carpentry work.
There he would die in 1735, at 59 years old, far from the homeland for which he'd sacrificed everything. His last words were reportedly about Hungary. He died still believing he'd done the right thing. Hungary's richest prince had ended his days as an exile dependent on Ottoman charity, his dreams of Hungarian independence buried in Turkey's sands.
Though Rákóczi's movement didn't achieve its main goal, it certainly wasn't in vain, as it prevented the Habsburgs from achieving Hungary's total subjugation. The Treaty of Szatmár, though representing a military defeat, preserved Hungarian laws and noble privileges that would have been completely eliminated following unconditional surrender. The war demonstrated that Hungary, despite its relative military weakness, couldn't simply be absorbed and assimilated into the empire without consequences. The Habsburgs had learned a costly lesson. Ruling Hungary required compromise and respect for its traditions, not just military force. In 1906, his ashes were brought back home to Košice Cathedral so his final resting place could be in Hungary. Even this goal was later frustrated when the Treaty of Trianon, signed barely a few years later, granted the city of Košice to Czechoslovakia. Consequently, Rákóczi's remains, leader and prince of the Hungarian War of Independence, lie in present-day Slovakia. A final irony for a man who dedicated his life to Hungary's unity and independence. Not even in death could he rest on Hungarian soil. His tomb in Košice became a pilgrimage site for Hungarians, a symbol of national resistance and freedom's price. Ferenc Rákóczi II remains in Hungarian collective memory not as a failure, but as a martyr who sacrificed his wealth, his family, and finally his homeland for an ideal that transcended him. Rákóczi's War of Independence established a historical precedent. Hungarians could be defeated militarily, but their spirit of resistance would never be completely broken. This legacy would resonate in every subsequent uprising, every struggle for autonomy, every cry for freedom in Hungarian history.
Drop a subscribe if this video changed your perspective on how independence wars can fail militarily but triumph historically. Because every week we analyze the forgotten struggles that defined entire nations' destinies.